Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to tell you about some different endgame ideas from practical games. Let's start with the first one. This is a game from 1970 between grandmasters Ullmann and Geller. They were two of the top players of their time. In endgames, one of the most important elements is activity. And in this case, it's quite clear that black's position is more active because the black rook is on an open file, and in fact it is already on the second rank, targeting white's pawn on f2 and limiting white's options. On the other hand, the white rook on c1 is in a passive position, already in a defensive position to protect against a future attack on the pawn on c4. Also, the black bishop is in a rather nice and active position on f6. The white knight doesn't have too many places to go to. Nevertheless, the situation is not that easy for black. Had white found the correct move, advancing the g3 pawn from a dark square to a light square, away from any potential attack of the black bishop, but more importantly, to prevent black's h5 move. If now black would play h5, after trading pawns, white succeeded in two goals. On one hand, getting rid of his doubled pawn on the g file, and in the other hand, isolating black's two pawns on the king side. White wouldn't have any serious problems here to save the game. In the actual game instead, white played passively and got punished because of that. White played king to f1. Looks like a harmless move, but in reality it allows black to further advance and limit white's options. h5 came, and now white played knight to e1, and black advanced further by playing g5, which opens the diagonal for the black king to come in and perhaps attack white's pawn alongside with the rook. White was hoping to exchange rooks, which would certainly benefit white in this case. Typically, when there is an offer of exchange between an active piece and a passive piece, obviously the side that has the passive defensive piece gains with the trade. So in this case, rook takes rook for black would be a mistake because it would exchange a piece that's active, that's on the offense, against a piece that's defending. The exception to that could be if it would result with an immediate material gain. But since that's not the case here, black smartly avoided a trade and in fact created a pin on the knight on e1. White wisely immediately moved out of that pin, but now the black king can freely advance. White played knight to f3, and black can simply continue marching up to f5. The plan is now, as I mentioned, to get even further with the king and then try to attack the c4 pawn by both the king and the rook. Black may play g4 also at some point, chasing away white's knight or not letting it back to f3. White played knight to d2 at this moment, and black played g4, not allowing the knight to come back. And now white's problem is a little bit that white will get into almost like a zugzwang type of position. For example, the white rook already has no reasonable moves in this position. The white knight has to also be very careful where it goes, not to be captured. So the knight moved to f1, and black further improved the position of his bishop by moving to d4. If now white would respond with a check, the king would just come to e4 anyway. White in the game continued with knight to d2. The problem with that was that it allowed rook g1. And finally, it's time for black to convert his positional advantage, his obvious advantage in activity of their pieces, to win material and win a pawn. The knight moved to b3, trying to trade the knight for a bishop. Bishop returned, and white has no defense against black capturing the pawn. It's true that it looks a bit tricky going into the corner with the rook, but the reality is that black calculated that it's actually safe to do that, because in the next move or two, black will be able to immediately rescue the rook on the h-file. And that's exactly what happened. After knight f1, black plays h4, king g2, and opens the h-file, making sure the rook is in no danger of being trapped. And then black can further advance the king. And the same plan going after the c4 pawn didn't go anywhere. Came rook h8, and white in the game actually resigned, because it's clear the black rook will come around, and if needed the king will help, and white will lose further pawns and the game. Let's move on to our next example, where the challenge is to trade or not to trade. This was the position in a game between Konstantinopolsky against Botvinnik in 1943. It was black's turn in the game, and black has a choice to move the rook away, to trade, or to protect the rook. And only one of them saves the game. Try to figure out which is the only move not to lose for black. In this case, the exchange of the rooks would be deadly for black, because the white king again is more active. It's closer to black's side of the board than the other way around. White, in fact, is threatening to go actually on either side of the board and go attack the black pawns, win one of them, and then create a passed pawn and win the game. And the problem is for black that after king d6, white has a very important and good move by playing b4. This is a very important move because it blockades one pawn, blockades three pawns. And that leaves white the two other pawns on c2 and a2 for future waiting moves when and if that will be needed. Now, for example, after g4, white could simply trade pawns and then run over to the king's side with the king and win the weakened g4 pawn. What would happen if the black king would move to e6, protecting the rook? That obviously already looks bad because it allows the trade by isolating one of the black pawns, and black would suffer for similar reasons as in the previous variation, that after king d4, black needs to stop the entrance of the king to c5, and after king d6, b4 again blockades the a6 and b5 pawns, and black will be in a zugzwang. The black king will need to move to left or right, and then the white king will be able to enter in the other direction. Let's go back to the starting position and see what the correct move would be. That move is rook c5, the only move to save the game. Now there is material balance. Black in the meantime attacks the pawn on c2. White played c4. came king e6, king d3, rook f5, targeting the white pawns through rook f3, rook e4 check, king d6, and after a few more moves, the two sides agreed in a draw. Let's see another example, also from Botvinnik. In the next example, Botvinnik had this position with black against Kasparyan in the Soviet Championship from 1931. Black, of course, is a pawn ahead, but as experienced players would know, in rook endgames, that's very often not enough to win the game. It may require a lot of very delicate and accurate moves to actually get the full point. In this position, the challenge is that the black pawn is still in its initial square and it needs still quite a few moves before it would be ready to get promoted. In fact, it cannot advance right away because the white rook on d5 is preventing it. The other challenge is that the white rook is threatening to go to d7 and attack black's queenside pawns. And this is one of those situations where activity is more important than material. And this is very common in such and similar kinds of rook endgames. So it is a priority for black to push his passed pawn as soon as possible rather than to maintain his extra pawn. And that is why Botvinnik in this position immediately played king to g6, saying goodbye to his pawn on a7. If black now would advance his a-pawn, white would just give a check on d6 and win the b6 pawn. So black doesn't look back, just forward, and pushes the pawn ahead. The white rook captured the pawn on a7, and the pawn advances further. And white went for a second pawn, trying to create his own passed pawn on the a file. And again, black cannot look back, cannot be on the defensive, but needs to further play actively. If black now would try to play rook g2 check, with the idea that after king e3 to protect the pawn, white would get very serious counter chances by playing rook b8 and getting behind black's passed pawn. And now, even though black's passed pawn reached the second rank, it's quite difficult, if at all possible, to win this position for black, because the white king keeps successfully away the black king from helping the pawn, and the black rook is busy protecting the pawn, and therefore, who will help the pawn to advance? Let's go back and see what happened in the game where Botvinnik correctly sacrificed the second pawn as well by advancing the h-pawn. White captured the pawn on b6, and now, very important, the king goes to g5. Going to f5 would be certainly inferior because it would allow the white rook to come behind the pawn. Also, moving to h5 out of principle is inferior because it oftentimes allows skewering ideas after playing rook b8 and then h8. So the ideal square is moving to g5. If now white would try to get behind the pawn by playing rook b8, then black would respond with rook g4, with the idea to play rook h4 after the rook gets behind the pawn. Therefore, in this position, white played rook b1, trying to hold off the pawn from in front of it, and now black simply brings the king. And the idea is to bring the king to f3 and then to g2 and promote it. White played king c2, h2, threatening with rook to g1. White played rook h1, king h3. And now the white pawn is too slow. It advanced by playing g4, naturally rook g1, rook takes h2, king takes. If a5, the black rook simply moves behind the pawn, and after king d3, of course there are many ways to win. Black just played rook e1, not even allowing the white king to get to e4 and then d5. So as we saw in this example as well, activity in endgames are extremely important. Let's see one more endgame from former world champion Botvinnik. This endgame was played against Floor in 1933. It is White's turn, and this is a technical example. White is already 2 pawns up, but nevertheless, it's never too late to mess up a winning game. Try to think and figure out what would you do here if you were White. What should be White's next move? In this case, the challenge is that Black has a rather advanced passed pawn on d3. White here has several moves that's worth looking at. One is, why not just capture the bishop and win another pawn? That would be a mistake, because in reality, that would give Black serious counter chances to save the game, because Black would win back 1 pawn immediately by rook c8 and then capturing on c3. And now White has a lot of pawns on unprotected squares, and Black is about to get another pawn after forking White's 2 pawns on the second rank. And even though White will be still at least 1 pawn ahead, but it's doubtful if it's enough to win. Also, it would be a mistake to insert an exchange of rooks first and then looking around, because Black would not recapture with the rook, but instead would capture the knight on c3. And then after rook a8, c2, in fact it would be Black who is winning and not White. Therefore, the correct move in this position is playing knight e4, simply moving the knight away from attack and at the same time controlling the d2 square, the advancement of Black's pawn, and create a threat potentially with knight f6 fork, and of course the bishop on g4 is hanging right now. If now Black immediately moves his bishop away, White would trade the pair of rooks and focus on advancing his own pawn further. Now, after rook f1, king h2 and rook d1, with the attempt to then advance the pawn to d2, it would be too slow, because also White's pawn is rather advanced and White can create some even checkmate ideas or pawn promoting ideas through check, if king c6, d7, king c7, and then bringing the knight to c5, threatening with check on e6 and then pawn promotion. So in the game, after knight e4, which is the simple but correct move, Black in the game traded rooks first and then brought the second rook to check, but that simply invites the king to its ideal square, which is to blockade Black's passed pawn on d2. Black moved the bishop, came g4, bishop g6, and after rook e6, Black resigned. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. This is an amazing endgame composed by Kisaretsky in 1842. If you look at this position, it's clear that black is 2 pawns ahead, which typically gives a secured win for the stronger side. It looks like a very normal position where many people would consider resigning or not looking for tactics. But this is one of those situations when white needs to combine tactical motives with knowing theoretical endgame positions. If here white would trade rooks, for example, it would lead to an easily won endgame for black. Moving the rook away to some random square also wouldn't help white. But what on earth could white possibly do anything else? Well, I'd like you to take your time and figure it out for yourself. Well, the first thing to recognize is that there is a stalemate possibility in this position. Can you see that? Well, that starts with giving up our bishop for just 1 pawn. If now the black king moves out of the check instead of the bishop capturing the bishop, then white in fact would win after rook takes rook. But what happens if in fact bishop does take the bishop? Well, then comes rook takes pawn check. Amazingly, after rook takes rook, game is over, it's stalemate. But what happens if black does not capture the rook and moves the king out of the check? Then, amazingly, white can afford to trade rooks, and even though black is a full bishop ahead with still pawns on the board, which normally is a win, remember this position is a theoretical draw as long as the white king reaches any of these squares. Then it's automatically draw. In this case, black cannot prevent the white king from simply moving back along the c1 h6 diagonal, simply going backwards and moving back and moving back and moving back. And now white achieved the theoretical drawn position even though black is a full bishop ahead. There is no way for black to chase the white king out of this fortress. Black can prevent the king entering the corner, but still cannot make progress, because anytime the white king moves to c1, the black king cannot come closer because it would result stalemate. So remember, this is a very important theoretical drawn position. Draw. Black cannot make progress. Well, hope you enjoyed this last position and of course learned some different endgame ideas in this lesson. The most important lesson to learn about endgames is that activity very often is a priority compared to a pawn. Well, I suggest you possibly go over again this lesson and learn how the grandmasters play the endgame. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week.